3D MJers, we are here to talk about efficiency. And I don't mean that as like a tech mogul experience of how to hack your life. I mean it from a perspective of something a little different than dedication, desire, and discipline. I think we often put on a pedestal, because we need to, working very hard, pushing ourselves to our limits, redefining what those limits are, and really kind of using that rise and grind mentality to be successful as athletes. Pushing through those hard training sessions when you're 6 weeks out, dealing with hunger cravings, going through a peaking cycle as a powerlifter despite your hips being achy, despite not wanting to ever squat, bench, or deadlift again because it's all you've done for the last 6 weeks, to therefore get on the platform or get on stage and be at your best. And that's important, but I think a lot of the times using the hammer of hard work makes it seem like the only solution is the nail. And instead, we need to think about how can we preserve as much of our willpower as possible to push ourselves further. And I think what we're going to talk about today is how we've seen that the latest advances in natural bodybuilding and powerlifting have come in the form of being more efficient, having a better dose response of each individual effort, rather than simply just making up for maybe not the most efficient or most strategic approach or most well thought through, with just kind of pure, huge amounts of volume, training to failure, cutting calories, overdoing cardio, etc. So I know this is something, Berto, that you think about a lot, and that you attribute to kind of these different phases of what we've seen in natural bodybuilding. So I was wondering if you could expand on maybe the differences between how we got shredded in 2010, and we did get shredded in 2010, versus, let's say, 2018, 19, 20, 21.
Yeah. Well, I think if we go a little bit beyond our era, I think the big issue with natural bodybuilding was that people didn't really respect the whole calories in, calories out thing, right? The whole thermodynamics. It was, hey, let's swap the avocado for some almonds. Maybe that'll work. Like that. That's where people were. And then, hey, this whole counting our calories, it makes sense. It makes things very predictable. We can, with enough time, we can get most everyone into some really, really gnarly shape. Because there was a point in time where, hey, a natural bodybuilder with striated glutes, no way. That's just not possible on, right? Unless you're like the top of the top in the IFBB. So for a minute there, once we all kind of cracked that code, we realized that, tracking calories works. We were getting everyone peeled, but at the same time, and I like to say this, if I could go back, man, like 10 years, there's just a host of kids that I worked with that, hey, we got what they wanted, but in hindsight, we could have done it a little bit more efficiently, right? So soon after that, once we've kind of, discovered how to get there, we started to take, these small steps to make the ride there a bit comfier, right? Things like, hey, let's start looking at our training a bit differently, right? Let's kind of try to just manage it or have a general idea of where fatigue is. Hey, refeeds, at some point diet breaks. At some point, hey, maybe we should start a prep at a more reasonable body weight, all sorts of things. And over time, I think not only have we made getting into contest shape a lot more efficient, a lot healthier, but by focusing on those metrics right there, you would think you'd take away from the bottom line, but man, 2010 shredded versus 2020 shredded, they're totally different things, So we, when you focus on being more efficient, which quite often, honestly, it's going to be health markers. It's going to be just overall quality of life, right? You end up getting better results. And I guess that's what happens when you work with human beings, which that's what we do. So yeah, efficiency. And to this day, like I'm still looking for little things here, little things there, to make the transition from, hey, starting a prep to getting on that stage as smooth as possible.
Yeah. And Berto, you brought up a memory in my brain from days of old, when we kind of inherited from our 80s bodybuilders, the whole 12-week prep, you know what I mean? And while, you know, those bodybuilders, it worked pretty well, there was reasons, you know, why it worked pretty well and doing a 12-week prep. And so we kind of inherited that, and we started kind of just using that as our model. And I think that was probably the first mistake. You know, we weren't really comparing apples to apples, because me and myself, I've kind of done both. I've kind of done the 12-week prep because that's what we inherited and that's what our predecessors did. And then I've kind of done things more similar to what we do now, where we say, you know, let's bring calories up for a time period, bring it down for a time period. We balance it better with life. And so that was kind of the first thing that I thought of, was that's kind of I think a byproduct of just kind of what we inherited, you know, from our bodybuilders of old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think much of the way bodybuilding was done was based in tradition, and it didn't come out of nothing. It wasn't just like you know, old religions that hung on to society, that we had these rituals that we don't really even understand anymore. It did come from something, and like you said, you know, the 12-week prep, often inherited from our enhanced people on the other side of the fence who have similar length cycles. And in an era where conditioning didn't have quite the same requirement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think yeah, it's all understandable, and especially when you look at bodybuilding in a time where it was less accepted, less researched. It was a little more associated with anabolic steroids, and it was very much a more niche, more counterculture, less accepted thing. Why would you look to like the scientific establishment of, you know, quote unquote lab coats, or people who are not attached to it? It really wasn't until like the late 80s and 90s where kind of science-based approaches were more popularized. Like, I mean, we think of the evidence-based quote unquote explosion as happening in the last like 10 years or so. But, you know, before that, there was Dr. Joe. Before that, I mean, there was Fred Hatfield. Like, it wasn't non-existent, but it certainly wasn't the norm. And now it has become something that I think is a lot more, you know, approachable. Like, there are researchers who do bodybuilding research, which was pretty rare back then. And you can look at the peer-reviewed record to see that. So yeah, like the eras, as I kind of think of, even just in the last 20 years, were definitely like, we're stuck to these old traditions, you know, in the very beginning of this kind of time frame. So that means only the very few who have low settling points, high caloric expenditures, and good genetics for holding on to muscle mass were able to get into shredded condition within the confines of the tradition we held on to. And then as the tradition started to change, we still kind of had the same mentality that you need to get anywhere close to contest shape in 12 weeks, which is crash diet and crush yourself, you know, and just go all out. I still remember videos of Brad Loomis doing his cardio, and just basically screaming and dying on YouTube, and the things that you pushed yourself through. And I think very much it was like a celebration of masochism, because it was the only way that you can get yourself in good shape in 12 weeks, while also taking the aggressive approach we took in the off season of taking the seafood diet approach. So, you know, like it's restrict, get huge, too huge. All right, now I'm 30 pounds over stage weight and I got 12 weeks. That's easy. Just eat broccoli and fish and then do all the cardio in the world. Who needs energy to do that? And who needs a libido or a menstrual cycle? That's all superfluous. So I think we expanded our timeline, and naturally, as any time you increase like distance or volume, intensity has to come down. And we started to get slightly better results dieting, you know, 16, 20, 24 weeks. And I think that's still more the norm now, with a slightly less aggressive approach. And that allowed people to get in really good shape. But still, so much of that earlier just kind of go all out mentality was there, that, yeah, more people were getting in shape for sure, just because of the time component. But at what cost? And this is where we started to see like metabolic damage become a very, very popular term. Because if you crush yourself for 20 weeks versus 12, yeah, we start to see a lot more consequences in the sport. And as the sport grew, from social media expanding. So I think the question was, all right, great, but at what cost is getting lean in 2010 resulting in? This is also when HIIT was super popular. So it was, all right, awesome. We understand energy balance. So anytime we plateau, just cut calories or add more HIIT intervals. What could go wrong, right? So I remember my own experience with this. Getting shredded in 2009 took me 9 months, resulted in me able to eat a small bowl of oats and get ankle edema within 30 minutes. And also I had a hamstring tear. So, I mean, that was not necessarily a uncommon contest prep experience. And I got there, but it was pretty much through sheer force of will. And there were points where I was eating, 1,500 calories for weeks and weeks on end. So, yeah, I think I gave a presentation on this at the UEBC last time I was there. That was all based on the idea of kind of managing global fatigue to get better results. And a lot of my slide titles were how to make training easier but no less effective, how to make cardio easier but no less effective, how to make nutrition tracking or monitoring easier but no less effective. And I almost felt like I was like doing something taboo in our culture just by even mentioning that it might be useful to make these processes easier. And I think a lot of the times we might fashion ourselves as, oh, we're evidence-based, we're rational, we're doing this, natural bodybuilding is healthier. At the core, if you even think of the idea of trying to make something easier, it feels like a dirty word. And how many times do our athletes check in with us and they think something's wrong, not because they're plateaued, but because they're not plateaued, they're making progress, and it doesn't feel as hard as they expected.
Yeah, it still feels wrong whenever, even on my end, when I'm like, is there something I should be doing? Am I maximizing this person? Like when they're like, hey, everything's going really well, coach, but just so you know, I got a little bit more to give. And oddly enough, I think, so a lot of the hard comes just from reaching new places. Like that's how I try to phrase it to them. It's like, hey, like now it's going to be hard, not because of everything we're doing to get into shape, but because you're about to get beyond this certain threshold of body fat, because your squat is we're looking at a 600-pound squat that you're going to have to walk out at some point here. Like it gets harder because you're able to push further, but you're able to push further because you were much more efficient, especially during those early stages of the process, whether it's like, the beginning stages of a powerlifting career, beginning stages of a prep. It's like, we don't want to, I remember in our era, Eric, there was that, the 500-pound deadlifter, it's like, that was everyone's wall because they put everything they could into that 500-pound deadlift. And they're like, oh, 600 in 6 months. And, we're like, no, you're not, bro. Like that was, they were so inefficient in getting to that point that it made getting to the next checkpoint that much more difficult. So,
I feel attacked. I hit a 500-pound deadlift. Well, I hit a 495-pound deadlift in 2006, and then I hit a 500-pound deadlift in 2009, and I hit a 573 like a month ago.
Well, Eric, maybe we stop tearing hamstrings, man. That would.
Who needs them?
So. Yeah, no, similar story. I was one of those guys. I got to 500 and I'm like to 600 and then the moon. And there was just so many inefficient things going on there. Everything from the way I was programming my deadlift to the deadlift itself, like the technique was, this is not going to work to get to that next stage. So, I mean, you see it now. I think you see it especially always with the younger athletes because, and this is especially prevalent in like the powerlifting junior class. It's like they take everything that we've done to ourselves and our athletes, and they've learned from our mistakes. And quite often, like the junior class is like right on the heels of the open powerlifters. So, yeah. And again, like what we had. Like we kind of had the same benefit. We had the Dr. Joes. We had like there were some pretty reasonable people in the bodybuilding world if you look deep enough. But compared to what is out there now, shoot, like to me now, like any coach, just about any coach can get someone peeled, shredded, striated glutes, but it's just more so, did you do it in the most efficient way possible? You know?
Yeah, because as you were going through your dissertation there, Eric, the phrase kept popping up into my little pea brain here. Work smarter, not harder. Work smarter, not harder. You know, and you're right. It is kind of taboo whenever we say that something should be made a little bit easier. You're frowned upon. You know, it's no, bro. You know, it's go hard or go home. You know. But yet at the same time, when you're talking about other avenues, business, you know, or anything else, now it's all about efficiency. It's working smarter, not harder. It's making money while you're sleeping, you know, all this kind of stuff, which is kind of what I think brings us to this conversation, because it is super valuable, you know, and something that I don't think we would have talked about this about probably 5-6 years ago. You know, but now it's almost like something we've been practicing for a while, but we've never talked about it.
Yeah. And what always grinds my gears is when I see people who think they're being like revelatory and just shocking the system and speaking truth, and they're like, work smarter and harder. And I'm like, yeah, we all know that. Like this is bodybuilding and powerlifting. No one is actually just, you know, I just don't want to work hard at all. You know, like I got into lifting the most I possibly could or dieting myself down to starvation levels of body fat because I like the easy life. You know, that's not a thing. So I think because there is this sense of pride and sense of self-identity based on how much willpower do you have. And again, I think it's deserved. I think it's important. There is this constant adjusting of looking at any proposition or any model of training or dieting as going, I need to remove the idea of adherence from it because that's not an issue for me. So you can, like, if you think about it, like when back in the day when everyone did the 12-week diets, I think like today, most bodybuilders didn't cheat on their diet. I mean, to the degree where they personally would consider it cheating, right? However, that seafood diet, binge, eat everything, go hard or go home in the kitchen mentality that was more prevalent in that era, I think to some degree was a direct consequence of being so restricted for those 12 weeks. And I think you see similar parallels with that work harder and smarter today. It's like, if you just say work smarter, it sounds like you're making it easier. So why not take advantage of working smarter so you can work harder? And to some degree that's true, but you can't use that proposition and forget the cost of working harder. I think people forget that working harder doesn't just produce results, it also produces fatigue, mental and physical. And we don't like to acknowledge the fact that busting our butts has a cost. Even among those of us who, and I include myself in this, will not allow ourselves to deviate from the plan in prep, that stress that you imposed on yourself, even if it didn't directly affect your adherence during contest prep, it's going to leak out somewhere else. So you may be burnt out from the sport for 6 or 7 years, which I've definitely seen. Yeah, and that was the cost of not cheating for 9 months, is because now you have to let your, post-comp prep PTSD regress and get to a level where you've forgotten about it before you do it again. So I think, yeah, if you kind of limit your mindset to, I don't cheat on my diet, I have iron will, and ignore the fact that, you were suffering for years after that, and just the idea of getting back on stage was something that you couldn't even fathom, then sure, that can be true, but it's not the reality. So I think what I've seen to be really successful for fostering bodybuilding careers where someone can compete, let's say a pro who competes every other season, so they have enough time to improve and recover, it really does require you getting them to the finish line with minimal amount of limping. And I'm not sure that's something we really considered as coaches back in the day. We were just okay with taking really, really extended off seasons because that's what it seemed like people needed. Mm-hmm. But now I have more and more seen the value, even though it doesn't show up in someone's stage pictures. It may not even show up within the first couple months of them posting about it on Instagram. and they may even not fully get it during prep, and that there is actually value in me making this process as easy as possible and you not suffering, even if you could have pushed harder and getting you into stage shape, because that's actually going to allow you to compete in the sport more times in the future. And I don't think I had that. It was impossible for me to have that perspective until I'd been working with athletes for multiple seasons end on end, and seeing some of them get burned out after working with me 3 times. And I'm not blaming myself that I directly caused them to burn out, but how can you know that if you've successfully prepped for, let's say, 3 seasons, and only in that first and third season did you even have 20% of the same athletes? You can't really see the long-term effect on their careers.
Yeah. I think it's harder for bodybuilders to connect that, because with powerlifters, you have the totals, so it's like, hey, at some point, maybe I want to be near 1,700 total, something like that, right? It's like, I just got my 14, but I know I got to, stay on the path and take care of myself if I want to go as far as I want to. With bodybuilders, it's a bit more difficult. And this was my initial resistance, Eric, to like being more efficient with my own training, was the fact that just personal experience from in other sports, I was just the laziest dude ever. Competitive as can be, but when it came to like actually putting in the work, like during practice and being a team player and all that, I didn't like that part so much, Bodybuilding was different. I was like, okay, here's my my final chance, man, to do something athletic and do it right. And it was my hard work that got me really far. At least that's how I felt. It's like, I'm willing to have. I remember Lane Norton at some point counted the sets during one of his lower body days. It was on the Avant Labs forums, and it was like he said, I did 35 sets for legs. Take your overtraining and shove it up here. And I'm like, okay, well, he's doing that. I need to do it too, And, it just eventually, my solution was, I'm going to throw as many darts as I can. That's basically what I was doing. And there's going to be some bullseyes in there, but like, damn it, I threw like 40 darts, right? So I'm going to nail some, right? But that was my, I didn't want to look at efficiency for the longest time, because it was my hard work that got me there. It was, at least that's how it felt. And I'm like, if I don't want to, I wouldn't say lose a skill, but this has got me really far. I'm not buying this whole, hey, like, let's try to control our effort, because effort is what got me here in the first place, right?
Yep. Yeah, it feels like you're betraying your identity, or you're soft, And I think that's, honestly, I'll be honest. I think it took me a couple of years to really, I intellectually understood it in 2009 and 10 and 11 and 12, and we did seminars about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I didn't really get it until maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to like condescend or make fun of people who are still struggling with it, because I think it's a very natural thing. And a lot of bodybuilders, that kind of like extreme ownership mentality and pushing yourself really hard and knowing that you have that self-efficacy, that you can push yourself to the point where it's actually unhealthy, becomes a life philosophy. It extends, and it should, and it's helpful to extend outside of that sport. It can make you better in many facets of life, and that's great. But that also means that as it becomes integrated in other facets of your life and deeply more embedded in your psyche and life philosophy, when someone comes along and says, we need to actually hold back here and here and here so that you can have a better outcome, that sounds like some kind of alien language. Like, better outcomes come from greater effort, not from holding back. I don't know what to say to that except that you suck, and I'm going to make a meme against you. So that's all I got, and I'm going to fit a rationalization to make that not make sense. So yeah, it's a tough thing for sure. And I think, like you said, Berto, it is more easily quantifiable in powerlifting, because there's some rate limiting factors there. Like, I'm not improving. I objectively, my total's not going up. I am getting hurt. While in bodybuilding, the rate limiting factor is almost like a sport ending. Like, by the time you get to the point where just huge amounts of effort pushing you to get shredded and you're done with that, you're pretty much done with the sport, you know, or you're taking many, many years off. I think Jeff Albert's actually, when you look at the length of his career, he is a pillar to stick-to-itiveness, because the way he used to do it and how much weight he's lost in short-term contest preps, and the number of times he burnt himself out to the point where he said, I'm retiring, but that came back. I think it speaks to the love he has for the sport, and maybe to, you know, how bad he doesn't remember things. Maybe he's really good at having amnesia about prior preps.
I remember seeing he used to send me hate messages on the bodybuilding.com message board forums. You know, when we were lining up to do the same show, he's like, Father Flex, I'm watching you, bro. Nice win last week. And I'm like, all right, I'm gonna have to peep this dude out. And I remember, you know, at this point, he knew some things we didn't know, and vice versa. And I remember looking at his dieting, and I'm like, this fucker's like waking up at like 2 a.m. to eat half a chocolate bar and go back to bed. Like he was eating something like 12 like small little meals, right? And it's funny because even then, when I was still, you know, I wanted to go out with my shield, I saw that, and I'm like, man, that's so inefficient. That's so inefficient. Like it's like, Brad, I wish I could just tell him, you know, yo, Brad, like, how about we just condense this into like 4 meals and, you know, stay in bed, dude, you know? So I might be stretching a little bit, but yeah, I could actually see it then. You were waking up to eat. Were you waking up to eat?
Yes, I was. Well, I mean,
Okay,
that's what all my coaches were doing and my mentors were doing. So I'm like, yeah, I got to do it too. Go hard or go home.
Every 2 hours, baby.
Yeah. So, you know, again, like I could see it at a certain point, but it was really hard to you know, apply that to myself, and that's why we still bounce ideas like around each other, because you know, I think I used to, the main thing that would make me look up to an athlete and be like, man, like that's like, I guess my definition of a dog was just someone who is going to make an orthopedic surgeon rich like one day, like that sort of bodybuilder, right? In hindsight. And like now it's that guy that can be objective. Like that is freaking scary. Like that's the dude you don't want to mess with, because you know, I'll see these athletes and they're in a period in their training where like it's like the pressure's on, and I'm like, oh man, you know, sometimes the decision is like a little bit more elbow grease, and then sometimes the decision's like I need to pull back a little bit, and it's those athletes that can do that like during crunch time that to me like those are the real dogs, man. The ones that are, again, it's like efficiency. It's what it's been, you know, all along. And shoot, man, like the sooner you can learn it, the better, because I could still feel you know, for a minute, remember, Eric, that deadlift you took at Body Tribe that you shouldn't have taken? You switched to, what was it? You switched to conventional for to sacrifice. I feel all my sacrifices to this day, like all those 40 dart days that I had, like that's what I feel right now at age 38. It's nothing new. It's nothing from the last decade. It's all that old stuff. So again, man, the sooner you learn to get out of your own way and become what I think is a dog, which is just an objective, rational, like thinker, especially when the stakes are high, the further you're going to go with yourself, man.
Hey guys, this is Andrew Valdez, just jumping in to let you all know about our newest free course in the 3DMJ Vault. It is called Blood Flow Restriction Training, and it was created by our team's injury reduction and management specialist, Nick Licamelli. As a physique and strength coaching company, we're always looking for tools to add to our toolbox that can help our athletes reach their goals efficiently and effectively. Over the past decade, we've learned about, implemented, and successfully used blood flow restriction training with certain athletes as a way to get results without having to use heavy weights, which has proven to be extremely valuable in a variety of situations. While BFR is not a replacement for heavy training, it is a scientifically sound way to supplement our lifts when needed in order to continue and sometimes improve athletic progress. In this course, Nick will help you understand how, when, and why BFR works. He will also lay out the specific mechanisms of muscular hypertrophy and strength, which populations and situations can benefit most from BFR, and most importantly, he'll deliver the X's and O's of how to actually use the cuffs and begin to execute this tool safely in the gym. We cannot commend Nick enough for what he's created, and we cannot wait to share these 2 hours of free educational content with you. So go to 3dmjvault.com, select the BFR course, click the Enroll for Free button, enter your email, and start learning. Again, that's 3dmjvault.com to view all of our video courses, including this new one, Blood Flow Restriction Training. Thanks in advance for checking it out, and enjoy the rest of the show.
we've seen glimpses when we were in denial, you know, and we were kind of saying, okay, work harder, you know, and smarter. We were using glimpses of being efficient, like you just said, Berto. You know, you were kind of the same way, but yet you were looking at me going, Brad, you know what? We could be so much more efficient and smarter about that.
Yeah.
You know, and it always reminds me of, like, I would usually start a prep and I would just immediately start just doing cardio, you know, just like every day. And I remember thinking to myself afterward, it's like, gosh, you know what? Why didn't you kind of use your health brain, your healthcare brain, and go, just use the minimum effective dose right now. Let's start small, you know, so that we have kind of some place to grow. So we always had those little pieces, you know, here and there of being more efficient. And so, yeah, I think that, to me, that kind of just brings the question, you know, how are we being more efficient now? You know, what are we doing now to kind of make those little bits and pieces kind of more global?
Yeah, you know, I was thinking, God, who's the guy who used to win his class in Team Universe? Amazing physique from the Bay Area.
Oh, Jeff Rodriguez.
Jeff Rodriguez, thank you. The other Jeff.
Yeah.
I remember seeing Jeff Rodriguez's prep, and you knew what his calories were going to be 2 weeks out and when he was 20 weeks out, because every week he dropped 100 calories from where he started.
Yeah.
Or it was 50 or something like that. But there was, and at a certain point, you add more cardio. At a certain point, you cut out food. And it was not at all based on where you were at. It was based on the assumption that it's got to keep getting harder as you get closer to stage to keep making progress. And it worked. Jeff Rodriguez was one of those natural bodybuilders who had striated glutes in an era where that was not common. But I mean, right now, the idea of obligatorily every week dropping calories, it's kind of like, why are you doing that, Doc? You know, like, don't you want to see if you're still losing weight or not? Or what if you're making progress fine? But
that was my prep in a nutshell. I had this 8-meal approach, and basically the Gregorian calendar, regardless of how I was responding or how good it was working, take meal 1, cut that meal replacement shake in half. Boom, 125 calories gone. The next week, you were having 2 scoops of protein, take one of those away. Boom, 105 calories. It was like that. And then, like, basically Gregorian calendar, every third week, whether you were responding or not, 10 more minutes of cardio, 1 more cardio session, what have you. You know, that was my preps in the early 2000s, basically in a nutshell.
And that's a great example of you were manipulating the variable that did causatively get to the outcome of being shredded, calories, right? You're manipulating energy balance. You had the piece that got you there, but you still had the hard work above all else mentality. And much like Jeff Rodriguez, Brad Loomis was one of the few people in the early 2000s who had striated glutes. So I think that speaks to the kind of whole let's work harder and smarter mentality.
Yeah. But if I can interrupt you just real quickly, because there's always the flip side of that. There's always cause and effect. There's always something that happens when you run that engine at 9,000 RPM for 20. You're going to shorten the lifespan of it, because in 2005, I didn't even really think about what I was eating. If it was in front of me, I would just eat it. You know, Sure, I kept up my training, but I didn't even want to think about bodybuilding in 2005. You know, that was kind of the cause and effect relationship, that cause of, like you said, Eric, grinding yourself into the dust. And to be honest with you, I'm almost shocked that I got on stage in 2006. And I really can't tell you why I did that, because I didn't really like bodybuilding in 2006. I just did it more so because it was more of my identity at the time, you know?
Yeah, I think a lot of us were on a collision course to quitting the sport much earlier than we had, if it wasn't for 3DMJ changing the way we did things. I can speak for myself and say that's absolutely true. That is what literally started the 3D Muscle Journey blog for Jeff, so I think we're all comfortable speaking for him. And as you just said, Brad, that's, you know, that was your experience. You can't even believe you did a 06 prep. So yeah, I think it's a good example that objectively, yes, manipulating the energy balance is how you get there. But there are many ways to manipulate energy balance that will result in you never wanting to do this thing again. And I think the same thing is true when we look at powerlifting. So I think of the kind of the as you say, Berto, the version 1 DUP as kind of
God.
the era. Yeah.
They should make a T-shirt. I survived that. Yeah.
Yeah, and did you though? Like, you know, like same kind of thing that Brad's talking about. A lot of us, I think, you know, it's the same thing like the Smolov era. Like if you ask someone how much did you gain off Smolov, they'll tell you some squat PR, and they go, "What do you currently squat?" And if it was within a year of that, it was less because they got hurt or they got burned out and they couldn't keep squatting. So it's like, yeah, bro, I did Smolov back in January, squatted 500 pounds, and it's April now. What do you squat? 460. Oh, okay. That's not the way that's supposed to work, but all right. Not to say that there isn't like peaking and stuff like that, but we're not talking about 40-pound drop off in a few months. So the awareness that both volume and intensity could influence strength gains, could influence muscle mass gains, more so the volume side, and then going, well, why don't we just maximize both with the highest specificity? It does work if you survive, but is there any actual advantage, or is it even possibly worse? And I think the research that's come out in the last couple years has been really telling. We have research now showing that peak intensity is more important for gaining strength rather than average intensity. We also have meta-analyses on volume and how they affect strength. So we've seen this dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, and we've talked about it many times. You know, you do 1 to 4 sets to failure, you might get 2/3 of your gains. You do 5 to 9 sets to failure per week, you might get up to 80%. And if you want that last 20%, you're doing 10 plus. And that's, you know, not a very efficient proposition, but for a competitive bodybuilder, you're probably going to try to get up into those high numbers. That relationship does not hold true for strength. All of the like when you compare 1 to 4 to like to 5 to 12, there's not a significant difference sets per week. You know, you'll see it sometimes, but consistently again and again and again, we see that training at higher loads with, you know, reasonably high or reasonably low volumes still produces the vast majority of strength gains. And I think the echoes of this we're now seeing it in the more, I would say, rational powerlifting communities we have, where we've got people doing singles with a greater frequency. And we were talking about this off air, how kind of the traditional model is you're not touching singles until you're pretty close to comp. You know, you got this kind of linear or even daily undulating approach where if you're 12 weeks out, you're not hitting anything underneath a 6 or 5 rep period. You might do different reps on different days, or you might step them down 2 reps per week, going from 10, 8, 6, 4. But you're hitting, you know, the 3 to 5 rep range when you're close to comp. You're hitting the 6 to 10 rep range when you're further from comp. And then within like the last week or two, you're hitting singles. But now, almost overlaid on top of that model is singles almost all the time. And they don't have to be that heavy, but it is basically looking at, all right, well, how do I get an efficient specific stimulus that doesn't put me into that redlining, like Brad was talking about? And like kind of the model that I've adopted in the way I kind of, and this is broad strokes, not the way I use it for everyone, just to kind of think about it, is that even when I am working with a powerlifter who's quite far out from competition, there might be some low rep work, some singles, doubles, triples that are hanging around like the 80% of 1RM range. You know, think of it this way, like a single at a 5 RPE. That's still pretty objectively heavy. You know, you're putting 80 to 85% of 1RM on your back and squatting it, but you're still 5-6 reps from failure. It's not hard. You don't need to get super psyched up, but you do need to treat it seriously enough to get your air in, do your 3-step walkout, take a second, make sure you hit depth, not tip forward, all that good stuff. And it's very good specific practice. And I think we've come to realize that that's a very low dose, but it's a very efficient dose of training that can do a lot for in those non-specific phases to hold on to strength. And the side benefit is you get to keep your finger on the pulse of where are you at. Is what you're currently doing enough to, say, preserve strength while you're working non-specifically, and then hopefully gain strength as you're getting more and more specific. So again, to kind of complete that model, far out from comp, a lot of non-specific work, a lot of hypertrophy work for this power lifter, but infrequent singles, maybe just once a week at a very low kind of mid-range RPE. Then as we get closer, yeah, it's just like the old school approach where we're getting into that moderately heavy load range. But now we've got maybe 2 singles a week at a moderate RP, 6 to 8. And then eventually as we get close to comp, we've got singles pretty frequently. And it is a little more like that V1 DUP minus all the volume, but that consistent heavy practice before we taper. And again, I think we are seeing a lot of people reach strength heights much more predictably these days. People are always going to have their own individual ability to get strong, but I feel much more confident these days that I can get someone strong with that approach and use that model to work around some of the limitations that they may have with volume, or they may have with what movements they can do with different frequencies, because we have that understanding where we just didn't before.
Yeah, I think if most of our bodybuilding audience saw what a powerlifting program looks like, they'd be like, "Oh, wow, that's not what I thought." Because maybe the last time they checked in on that world, it was Louis Simmons' time, with the max effort, dynamic effort, like that sort of deal. But it's so different. It's so different, and and especially in powerlifting, like what sort of approaches, techniques a lot of like the leading coaches are coming out with, or ways at looking at a certain concept. It's like every year it makes significant progress, and again, it's because they have that bottom line, that total to guide them. Like, is this working? Is this not? But yeah, way different from how we did it. Like, when in doubt, it used to be like, hey, you know what? Your squat's stuck. Run that small off. I bet you it's going to work, which was the equivalent of like I guess the 1,000 calorie diet for a 190 pound man. I was like, it's going to work. You're going to get some good fat loss, but there's going to be consequences for sure. So not very efficient. Yeah. I hope this is helping people out there, because I think that's probably that our folks out there are starting to get it, because that's the biggest issue. Like when I get an application, as we were discussing, what do we talk about today? I'm like, it's like, hey, yeah, I think Eric mentioned efficiency, right? That's we had a bunch of topics that were kind of hinting at like how this situation and that situation was lacking that in its approach. And that's what I look for when it comes to like the applications and what the athlete is doing. It's like, all right, let me see where we can be much more efficient. Because if you're much more efficient, safety, health, like that's going to be more likely to remain intact. But efficiency means you're going to be able to add to your stack a lot more efficiently, a lot faster. So yeah, like it's not sexy. We're not saying don't work hard, but you got to be objective and look for little cracks in your system. And honestly, I learned when it comes to applying it to myself from looking at other people's stuff. Because even when we were, like at the peak of our bonehead, meathead status, like I remember there was a few reps that you took, Eric, that one day that you were filming that relentless warrior video for Jeff on the squat. I'm like, look, I'm psyched for my boy, but should he really be taking some of those reps right now? Right. So yeah, I think most people are pretty good at catching on like what other folks are doing. They're like, and the hard part is, of course, applying it to yourself. And that's why having a mentor or some form of coaching, I know it would have helped me early on for sure. That's probably what I needed more than anything else, along with the educational component. I do feel that the more you know, the less. Now that I know more, I'm a little bit less reluctant to get off the gas, because I understand what makes things actually go. So, hey, there's one for education and how important that is, and how much people spend way too much money on their gym outfit, right? The newest belt, the newest supplements. And it's like, how about spending some on your education? Because that's really where, it's at. That's where you should be investing.
That's well said. And I think it's just to kind of articulate the importance of this more specifically. I think we said it pretty well with bodybuilding. Like, we see a lot of people quit the sport. We see a lot of people who burn themselves out specifically because the hard work is something they can't sustain over a career. And unfortunately, they don't get to leave the sport on their own terms. They are essentially forced out by that by that proposition. And I think in powerlifting, while bodybuilding it's psychological, and powerlifting a lot of times it's biomechanical, it's physiological, right? It's injury.
Yeah.
And just to give some people kind of some idea of numbers on this, like if you look at the injury rates in powerlifting, they're actually quite low, and they're less than sports that are either contact sports or incidental contact sports like soccer or basketball. Far less than it actually, but it depends on how you count it. So they might be like 1 to 4 injuries per 1,000 hours of training, which could be as little as, depending on how frequently you train and how often you train, 1 injury a year. But that's defined as needing to take, like, completely not train, like take time off training completely, meaning you can't train around it. So it's a pretty significant injury. However, there was a study by Strombach in 2018 where they found that 87% of the powerlifters they surveyed had to do some modification of training based on, pain or injury, meaning they had to alter grip width, or maybe they couldn't deadlift, but they could squat. So injury is a part of life as a powerlifter or as an athlete, I would say, to various degrees. It may not be something that keeps you out of the gym and you're in a brace for 4 months, and that hopefully is very rare if it happens at all. But you absolutely are going to get banged up from having to squat the heaviest load you possibly can, and to do that regularly in training so that you can do it on the platform, and do the same thing with bench and deadlift. And I think a lot of people, the idea of being in pain most of the time, somewhere to some degree, or potentially having an injury that not only affects your ability to be a powerlifter, but your quality of life outside the gym, means that they go, you know what, this whole strength sport thing isn't for me. You accrue a couple of injuries and eventually you're like, nah, this isn't worth it. The risk is no longer worth it. And I think all of us can probably individually think of times where we considered that risk. I remember when I had what I thought I was going to have to get fucking neck surgery, I was like, no, I'm good. I'm just going to bodybuild. And it resolved itself, and I eventually came back to it. Berto, I remember you telling the classic story of how during your 2008 contest prep, you got that back injury that resulted in that really bad sciatic pain, and you were like, oh, I wonder if I could take up a new hobby like painting or something like that.
Yeah. I thought it was done. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Brad, I remember when we were working together for powerlifting, and your ribs started to just become this constant hindrance to where you couldn't train the same way. And I don't want to speak for you, but it seems like you haven't had that same passion for heavy strength training until recently, when you've really learned how to work around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that was about the time I was thinking about, maybe I'll go back into bodybuilding.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I think just understanding that it's going to happen. And if you take that proposition that exists across powerlifting, regardless of the approach you're taking, and then you go, sweet, let me just do all the volume and let me do all the intensity. That's why we saw that huge, what seemed like anecdotally, a ton of injuries were happening when people took that kind of work harder and smarter approach. Mm-hmm. So when I look to train a powerlifter, I really am sometimes closer to the end of the proposition of how can I get measurable progress with this person with the least stress, the least specific work. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think, infrequent singles at a low RPE have a great place, and then doing non-specific work on other lifts. It's almost like I understand that the closer I get to that fire of specific powerlifting, the more progress I'll get, but there's also higher risk. Okay, well, how can I skirt the edges of it and still get all the benefits, or most of the benefits, or even just enough benefits to progress without potentially risking things? Because I want you to be able to powerlift. Right now you're in your 20s, in your 30s, 40s, and maybe even 50s. So that's really what it comes down to, is making sure that you don't sacrifice a slightly steeper slope of progress for that slope ending decades earlier. Now, some people don't have that mentality. They want to die early and leave a big coffin behind, and they don't care. They just want to get as much out of it as quickly as they possibly can. But I know I don't feel good about that as a coach. That's not the person I can work with. I feel like that's unethical, because that person thinks they want that now, and maybe that is what they want, and they'll look back and have no regrets. But I know enough people who do have regrets that I don't want to be a part of that calculus. So, yeah.
You guys have, this has been a good conversation. I almost forgot at one moment listening to you guys that we were recording a podcast, because I was kind of I felt like the student there for a second. I was really into what you guys were saying. So good job there, high five. But that being said, I did have a couple of notes, thoughts that popped up in my head where I made a couple of notes. Because one of the things that people will say is like we alluded to earlier, this feels too easy. This feels like it should be harder, and me as a coach, of course, I'm the one from the outside, and I can kind of look at things and I can kind of say, well, you know what, we don't need to do that now. We're getting what it is that we're after. But at the same time, I do like to put little notes, in their spreadsheet. I'll put in there, somewhere that says, right now it feels pretty easy, because I can kind of refer back to that, because if we do need to dig, which we're all going to have to do, and that's one thing we probably all just need to reiterate here is at some point, yes, it's going to suck, and at some point you're going to have to, what's that Navy SEAL term? You're going to have to embrace the suck, because you're going to have to, it's an extreme sport, you're going to have to, it can't be easy all the time, and plus we don't have all the answers, but sometimes I can look at my notes and I can say, okay, what was going on during that period of time where it felt pretty easy? I can kind of maybe find little clues, was their volume really low? Were we during a deload? Were we, was life a little bit easier at that point? Oh, well, look at there, they were off from work for 2 weeks, or something like that. And then I can kind of set things up, kind of like we were talking about earlier, where we or Eric, what you alluded to, what's the most amount that I can get while doing the least, or like our philosophy a lot of times in dieting is how much food can we possibly eat while still getting the fat loss that we're after. I can find little clues in those notes, and I can kind of say, okay, well, we need to dig now. We need to make big strides in weight loss, fat loss, whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. And I'll kind of look for those little clues that say, okay, what can we do now to kind of set up that kind of environment? You know what I mean? Can we manipulate training variables? And, I'm not above thinking out of the box and doing, like you mentioned, Eric, powerlifting type program for the bodybuilder to where it seems like it's absurdly low, but at the same time, it's still training. The stimulus is still there, and get that same response that we need while still making it feel kind of easy. You know what I mean? Can we set up our cardio, in such a way that, maybe like we kind of learned, it was kind of like it was almost wasn't worth the bang for its buck in a way, can we just do things a little bit easier? Maybe we can get the cardio we need on a nice hike, or something like that, But those were kind of the things that were popping up in my little pea brain as I was really into your guys' conversation and kind of listening to you. Because, really what it all boils down to is I use this analogy a lot with clients. It's kind of like, okay, the water is boiling and we have the setting at 7. Does it really help to boil the water if we turn it up to 10? What? Sure, it's going to stay boiling, but we're using more electricity. That's always the analogy that I kind of use when we talk about efficiency.
That's a good one. I think it's one of those things where you can intellectually understand what we're saying, and I think probably a lot of our audience is nodding along. But when you actually get there, it is one of those things that it's scary to try something, to feel like maybe I'm not doing what's quote unquote optimal, or maybe I could push harder. And you see this in the resistance against just the amount of hate of the idea of tracking how many repetitions in reserve you might have in some bodybuilding circles is absurd, just because it means you're not training to failure, Yeah. I think you can find this attitude predominantly in a lot of areas, and I think you did a great job of bringing us to the point of acknowledging that you absolutely will have to play the card of pushing yourself to the limit, but it's a question of, is that going to be happening to the point where it shortens your prep or shortens your career or prevents the next season or causes an injury? or is that going to happen only when needed so that you can get to an elite level of performance? A good parallel was that by the time I had done my first show in 2019, I was in good shape. I wasn't in great shape, but I really didn't feel hard. Nothing was hard. And when we needed to start striking, I had a ton of mental reserves to do that. And I got into the best condition I've ever gotten in my life. So I think another parallel would be that, these singles you have in, let's say, a powerlifting prep, they get you to the point where you're like, oh, wow, I'm in striking distance of a PR. And I know that if I do these a little more frequently, it does start to beat me up, but I don't need to do it for 2 months. I don't need to do 5x5 for 2 months to get there. Now I can just in the next few weeks get to the point where when I taper, I'm going to reliably hit a PR on the platform because I was able to get further with less effort and being less banged up in the process. So don't ever think you don't need your card-carrying member of 3DMJ, your dedication, discipline, and desire card that you need to slam on the table every time you decide to take the plunge, because you will. But you don't want to be getting that out right at the start, because that card has a cost. So I think that's a really important point, Brad, is that that's something that play needs to be there. And it's actually a very empowering thing to know I could go a lot harder. If the going gets tough, I can do what's needed. I don't need it now, but that means that I can do a bunch of shows. I can push myself through this whole season. I don't have to take time off work. I don't have to not try to be an asshole so much because I'm just not as much of an asshole because I'm not on 30 grams of carbs, So it allows you to titrate and be just a better human throughout prep in the process. And I think that's probably something that is difficult to appreciate until you've been through the process multiple times.
For me, my hard work button card was kind of like my blankie almost, man. When I was a little fearful, didn't know quite how to get to that next level. It's like, okay, well, we'll just rely on this, And now, for example, I think if I were to show my current training system to myself 15 years ago, that dude would be like, no, we're not running this, man. We're not, no way. Like, let me add a few things. And it's all out of fear, right? So like you said with the, powerlifting analogy with the singles, doing a little bit more of that, but in a controlled manner, when you know exactly what makes what move, it's a lot easier to just simply focus on the stuff that matters. Like I'll get a bikini athlete who maybe she was doing like 8 different movements for glutes. And it's like, guess what? 3. It freaks them out. And I'm like, we don't got to do more than 3. Like if we like progress on these 3 movements, I guarantee you your glutes will look better. And you're going to feel a whole lot better as well, because we're only using up as much energy as we have to. So yeah, again, a lot of it comes back to if people knew better, they would do better. And why it's so important to understand what is it that is going to, create the adaptations you want, or make you stronger as a powerlifter, right? But it's a hard sell, because most of us who make it decently far in this, it's because we were able to outlast at a certain point. Like all my training partners that I came up with, like I am here because I was the guy that stuck to it. A month later, they were all done, and I was looking for someone to come lift with me and spot me. So I felt like I was, like it was a part of me that I was turning my shoulder to, and it's the furthest thing from the truth. And I can say for myself that, man, if I was born 20 years later, like I think I'd be such a better bodybuilder right now. But what can you do, right? And a lot of it is just because I see all the stuff that's out there in regards to information, and I know that at some point I would have gravitated towards that. And again, when you know more, when you know better, I really am a firm believer that people do better.
Yeah, and it kind of helps too to try to put a bit of a crystal ball out there in front of you, because a lot of times I myself have to reserve the 3DMJ card when it's like, okay, what I want is happening right now. It's not the way that I would set it up, or it's not necessarily hard, but it's happening, And so you can't argue with the results of what's happening. And a good example of this is I just had a bikini competitor prep here recently, and we never had to pull the 3DMJ card that we thought we were going to have to do. We did the whole setup. We met for a good hour and a half, and we're like, okay, you know what? Here's the calories we know we're going to have to get to at some point. It was, I'm not going to lie, it was low. You're talking like 9,000 calories a week, which is, you can only figure out that's 7 days a week. That's not very many calories, and some of those days are going to be sub 1,000. But here's what we're probably going to have to do. But let's start out this way. Let's start out with easing into this. Like I talked about, let's just do 15 minutes of cardio 1 day a week instead of an hour, 7 days a week. Let's start out with this, and then we'll have some place to go. We can step down to those macros that we need to use. We never got there. We never had to use those low macros, those low calories that we thought we were going to have to use. And I mean, that's like one of the best feelings ever. In fact, we never, ever stepped down calories because it was happening. What I wanted was happening. It was like, I've lost 200 grams this week. I've lost 100 grams this week, Every week we were losing just a little bit. And it's, get out of your way. If it's working, just stick to it, And I've got another bodybuilder who we're not tracking macros yet. We're not tracking calories. We're just saying, you know what, eat intuitively. And I've had to kind of a couple times bite my own tongue because it's like, we need to start tracking calories at least. We need to make sure that the deficit that we're after is happening. And then I have to kind of rationalize, look at the spreadsheet and say, what we want is happening. Just let it happen, And that's kind of another version of efficiency that I think that we need to I don't know, not necessarily address, but at least mention is that and Eric, this was a square that you just recently created. Don't make a problem out of something when there's nothing wrong. Mm-hmm. Or don't create a solution out of a problem when there isn't one, is kind of the bottom line.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it, is what they say. Yeah, and not only that, if nothing's broke, don't break it because you're trying to solve it, right? So yeah. I think something you both brought up, Brad, you mentioned how if a client is telling you, hey, this is actually quite easy, we're making progress, you make note of that. That gives you a data point. And Berto, you mentioned, hey, out of fear, I might have this bikini competitor doing 8 different glute movements. Let's bring it down to what we think is essential. In both cases, you're getting more information by taking the more efficient pathway. Because we know what happens if you do all 8 movements and you make glute progress. You're going to keep doing 8 movements. Which ones are essential? I don't know. I got to do it all, right? Also, you don't have to write down on a spreadsheet how much more you could do, or if it was easy, when you ensure that it's the hardest thing possible. The answer is always, this is the hardest thing possible. Yeah. And if it works, you have no idea whether you need to do 50% of that, 80% of that, 70% of that, or 60%. So by doing what is needed, you're giving yourself the ability to move forward and adjust. However, if you start at the end point, the only question is, how long can I keep this up before I break? And if it's not long enough, then you're not going to get into peak shape. If it is long enough and you do get into peak shape, I feel bad for your family in the off season. Or even probably during that prep. And I feel bad for you because it's not going to be pretty afterwards. So the concept of signal clarity is also something we should talk about by being more efficient. Is that when you approach from the other end of the spectrum, not just starting at the hardest thing and then, letting the wheels fall off and backing off when you're forced to, but instead start with a conservative estimate of what is needed to get the job done, you can move forward. You can go, okay, you know what? We were doing RDLs, hip thrusts, and high bar squats, and we didn't see much improvement in your glutes. All right, let's add in some abduction, let's do some single leg work. We'll go from 3 movements to 5 and up your volume a little bit. Because also you mentioned on your spreadsheet, just like Brad said, feeling very well recovered from training, could have another day, could do more volume. Awesome. Well, let's take that next step. Oh, we saw progress. Fantastic. I was wrong. We didn't just need 3 exercises, but we sure as hell damn didn't need 8. We needed 5. Yeah, exactly. And the same thing can be true with just taking the approach that Brad is doing. Hey, we're generally trying to be satisfied at meals but not full, and we're trying to make sure we're losing at least a pound a week. That's happening. All right, now being satisfied at meals, maybe your eating behavior's changed a little bit, we're plateaued. Okay, cool. We have a general idea from last prep or your off season where your calories should be. Let's make a conservative estimate and actually start tracking. Awesome. Now we're seeing progress again. Now we need to cut calories instead of going, well, every week, just like Jeff Rodriguez style. And by the way, only respect, huge shout out. We're talking, 15 years ago, and he was the only guy getting in shape. So obviously he was cream of the crop at the time, cutting 100 calories a week, adding 10 minutes of cardio a week. So I think the reality is that you aren't working harder and smarter when you think you are. You're actually working a little bit dumber by pushing yourself to the absolute limit at whatever point you are, because you're not able to gather data. You're not getting that signal clarity in the examples I used.
One way of putting that clearly, back in the era where everyone wanted to charge up their metabolism. Remember that? Everyone wanted to lose on like 2,500 calories. So it was funny, when it comes to starving, bodybuilders don't play when it comes to efficiency. Like, right, it's like, if you could make it so that I only have to starve that much, that would be fantastic, right? So again, what a lot of people do with the system they apply because of fear is 1,200 calories. Let's just do it because it's for sure going to work. When, hey, in reality, there's like some sweet spot right then and there. So yeah, I always say that like the powerlifters, I think when it comes to the training and the fatigue, and just looking at all the moving parts, like what keeps you healthy in regards to sets per week on this exercise, like all those moving parts, like they do a fantastic job. The bodybuilders do a fantastic job for the most part, or better anyways, when it comes to being as efficient as possible with like the dieting. And sometimes I wish they would just kind of look at each other, because they would learn a whole lot. And it's hard to just sit here in the middle sometimes and be like, hey, bro, it's like, look at this dude. Like this kid just added 75 pounds to his squat, and he feels fantastic, and hey, this guy just got peeled out his mind, and he's not as messed up as you think he should be. And there's probably some hints there in regards to the systems that they are using that you can apply to whatever your specific goal is. So, So yeah, no, the starving though, everyone wants to, I remember that everyone wanted to reverse out slowly so that they could eat as many calories as possible, and then, not have to diet so hard.
Well, Berto, you're hardcore 08 prep, where you were on far fewer calories than you would eventually learn you needed to be on, and the reverse diet afterwards, where you were adding, I think 5 grams of carbs a week. Was that what you were doing for like?
It was 25. It was the safest thing. Yes.
Yeah. 25. So 100 calories a week. So you did a reverse Jeff Rodriguez out of prep. You learned how much you were overdoing it unnecessarily, because you were. Oh yeah. I don't think you gained a pound for like 2 months.
Yeah. My carbs got up to 500, and I literally looked the same. So I walked them from 175 on those really slow increments all the way up to 500, and I looked basically contest ready. Yeah. So
which did not help the normal people like me, because I was like, oh, well, it worked for that guy, it's going to work for me. And so then, of course, I was doing the same thing, thinking I'll be able to get my grams of carbs up to 500 and eat all this, not knowing that Alberto's got that, Hammy the squirrel metabolism that was there to begin with. We were just not doing things very efficiently.
Well, that's exactly it, Brad, is that some people looked at that and went, we should write an ebook about reverse dieting and how you can add 25 grams of carbs for 10 weeks and stay shredded. Another way to look at that was, why was this guy dieting on 150 grams of carbs?
Why was he on like what 2,000 calories, 1,900 calories, something like that, Berto?
Yeah, you don't lose 40 pounds, over 40 pounds with no adjustments, like unless like the deficit was that steep. Yeah. And weighing in once a week, which you would think at some point I'd get a funky weigh in, but no, I always lost enough to the point where, So again, that's why like knowing where these thresholds are and checking off, trying to gather the really good data is so important, man. Because I think, not that prep, the prep was very difficult, but it was kind of masked in the fact that I was getting fantastic results, right? which was my style at that point, right? It's like, hey, diet on 1,900 calories, 40 sets per workout, 50 if need be. So I guess I didn't know any better, but I think a much more sensible athlete, if I would have been taught right, I probably would have caught on early on and, would have been able to tell Lane, who was my coach at the time, that, hey, bro, like, I think this is probably a little bit more assertive than it needs to be. So, again, yeah, I think now that we're wiser, we all kind of know where that sweet spot is in regards to like chugging right along. And I think that's something that, as an athlete, once you figure out what that feels like, what's appropriate when you're, and for all cases, like off-season progress, getting shredded, what you should feel like towards the, that weird spot in the powerlifting cycle where, the taper hasn't really started just yet, like how messed up should you be and what that might mean for the taper itself. It's just good to have an athlete that can relay that all to you, and that just comes with the experience. But it's a feeling, and once you kind of know what that's supposed to feel like, you can actually trust your feelings and be objective based off like what you're sensing yourself at a personal level.
Well said, dude. Well, gentlemen, I think we've made our point. We've pointed out all the various ways over time of how being more efficient can be a huge boon, whether that's just enabling you to stay in the sport longer, preventing injury, preventing some pretty horrendous relationships with food, and even just giving you more clarity so that you can have a more individualized, optimized approach, because you've seen what are the constraints, what are the limits of what you need to progress, and where do you progress best and what's too much. Things you can't find out if you just start with the most you can handle. So we thank you for listening. We hope that you understand this not only intellectually, but maybe we got you a little bit closer emotionally as well. But if not, that's okay. It took us years as well. And I look forward to seeing you next time on the 3DMJ podcast. What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler. We cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or an athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, in audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits for most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the products tab. Thanks for your time, and thanks for listening.